Look, to be completely honest, I never really had all that much interest in this remake. I finally played the original Silent Hill 2 just over a year ago, and while I really enjoyed the game, it didn't exactly end up in my top 10. It's undeniably a phenomenal game, and definitely one of the greatest horror games ever made. Definitely not gonna argue against all that, but it's not my personal favorite. I was always more of a Resident Evil guy. So, as neat as I thought the Silent Hill 2 remake was, I wasn't dying to play it, or even see it made. On top of that, I have never touched the Bloober Team game before, and I haven't necessarily heard the best things about their previous works. So I wasn't really expecting all that much from a remake helmed by them anyway. Beyond that, there's the fact that the Silent Hill series has had a historically terrible track record since it peaked with Silent Hill 2 in the first place. Do you remember the Silent Hill game released last year? No, you don't. No one does. All of these factors combined had me writing off the possibility of this game being anything more than average at best. Then the reviews came in, and I was kinda shocked. It got damn near universal praise. 9s and 10s across the board, and while you shouldn't rely solely on reviewers' opinions, myself obviously included, that was still real surprising to me. I wasn't expecting it to be awful or whatever, but I also wasn't expecting to have one of the highest Metacritic scores of the year either. Seeing such glowing praise instantly made me way more interested in checking it out for myself. I love me some survival horror and was probably going to get around to it eventually regardless, but at this point I was actually excited to play it. Plus I needed something to do to kill time until Metaphor released, so 2 birds, 1 plank of wood. So I did it. I checked out the game, and I am happy to admit that I very clearly misjudged this remake. It's pretty damn great. I know I'm late to the discussion, but Metaphor released like 3 days after Silent Hill 2 and immediately engulfed all of my free time. I wasn't even going to do a video on it because of my tardiness, but despite it being like a month late, I still want to talk about this game. One of the reasons I enjoy making these videos is because I love video games and I love sharing my thoughts on games I particularly enjoyed, and this remake is one such game. Anywho, let's get on with it. When playing the original Silent Hill 2, there was one issue I had with the game that stuck out the most. The combat. I really didn't like it. Most enemies felt like a non-issue, since beating them to death with a plank of wood was super easy, barely an inconvenience. That not only took away from the horror element of the game, but also made a lot of the game just sort of boring, gameplay wise. Oh god, then you had the boss fights, which I did not gel with on any level. Absolutely hated them. Thankfully, all that has been mostly rectified with the remake, and the new improved plank swinging is surprisingly fun. The combat has been completely revamped to better fit with the switch to the over-the-shoulder third-person perspective. James can now dodge enemy attacks with a simple press of a button, and the enemies are much harder to stun lock. There's a fluidity and rhythm to the combat in this remake that makes it way more satisfying as well as intense. I've seen the argument floating around that James being able to dodge, dip, duck, dive, and dodge baddies like a pro takes away from one of his main appeals as a protagonist. He's an everyman, a regular boring dude in an insane situation doing his best to just survive. Turning him into more of an action man works against that appeal, but I think the game manages to balance out the more mobile and competent James with much more vicious enemies. They are brutal and threatening in a way I never experienced in the original. Thanks to that, James still manages to feel like he's barely scraping through each encounter. As the game goes on and more enemies are introduced, the survival part of survival horror really gets to shine. At no point in the game did I feel like I was completely safe, which works so well for a horror game such as this. I guess I could just suck at the game, that's very possible too, but either way I liked it. On a less significant note, the remake also does a better job of feeling like a survival horror game in terms of resource management. The simple combat of the original meant you could end up overloaded with ammo and health givers and all kinds of other nifty whatevers. My experience with the remake felt much more balanced. Resources were scarce enough that I felt the need to avoid using my guns if at all possible, something that was never a concern in the OG. It's still far from feeling like an early Resi game where every shot counts, but it's much better handled than it was before. Everything else gameplay wise also manages to live up to the original in one way or another. I adored the puzzles of Silent Hill 2 Classic, and this remake did not disappoint with its puzzles either. Most of them are neat remixes of the ones seen in the original, and there are even some entirely new puzzles that fit in perfectly with the rest. For the most part, they all feel like solid throwbacks without just being lazy copies. And just like the original, you can select the difficulty of the puzzle solving separately from the combat, which I loved there and I love here. The other big standout for me with this remake is the environments. I think they look fantastic. Not only are they faithful high-res recreations of the ones from the original game, but they also managed to be way more goosebump inducing. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, the original game wasn't all that scary to me. It definitely had its moments, but I was mostly in it for the story and puzzles. This remake did such a good job upping the scare factor that I felt tense throughout my entire playthrough. A big part of that was how successful they were at recreating the eerie and creepy settings from the original. Couple that with fantastic sound design and you have the perfect recipe for a genuinely frightening experience. I legitimately haven't been as consistently on edge playing a horror game since Signalis. Obviously a lot of credit has to go to the original devs and art design. So much of what makes this remake terrifying are elements taken from the original and enhanced with modern tech and game design techniques, but the original is still a classic for a reason. I'm definitely biased though. I've always enjoyed the over-the-shoulder perspective for horror games more than the fixed camera tank control stuff. It always feels more personal to me, like we are experiencing the game right beside the protagonist, which therefore brings you closer to the action. So naturally, I appreciate the change here, even if it does take away from the charm of the original to some degree. In regards to the story, it is basically untouched in any major ways. All the pivotal moments of the original are retained almost identically, keeping the main story intact. There are some additional bits thrown in here and there, and some of the details have been changed, but none of it is handled worse than the original, just a bit different sometimes. Additionally, and this may fall into spoiler territory, I guess, so be warned, there are some hints to an actual explanation behind these differences. Basically, it is suggested that the remake is actually James's second or beyond trip through Silent Hill, like he is trapped in some kind of repeating time loop shenanigans. Throughout Silent Hill 2 Remake, you can discover little Easter eggs connected to the original game that not only serve as fun nods, but also seem to imply James has done this all before, and this remake might secretly be a sequel. For example, in the original game, there's a point where on the roof of the hospital, Triangle Face spooks James so hard he trips through a fence, falls off the roof, and lands in the psych ward. Similarly, in the remake, James is once again ambushed by Triangle Face on the hospital roof, but this time old T-Face chokeslams James through the floor, causing him to land in the psych ward from a different spot. It's the same general event, but the details are different. On the roof in the remake, you can actually see the part of the fence James falls through in the original, damaged and everything, like he's already experienced that event before. I really like this as a concept because it not only explains away the discrepancies between the OG and the remake, but allows them to both exist separately but simultaneously. I think it's a pretty good way to handle a remake. I know there's a lot of talk these days about how much media is being remade, everything from movies to TV shows and video games. Out of all those, I always felt that video games were the most deserving of the remake treatment. The interactive nature of the medium and how that has evolved so rapidly over the years makes video games feel outdated in a way the other types of media don't. Not every game remake is good or even justified, but I think Silent Hill 2 from the Bloobs is one of the good ones. It successfully modernizes an already great game in a way that doesn't lose sight of what made the original so iconic. In fact, I find it to be one of the most authentic to the original without just being a one-to-one copy remake that I've played. Does that make sense? I didn't get to play the original when it released. I was 4 years old, but I think people who get to experience Silent Hill 2 for the first time via this remake will have a similar experience to what people had with the OG in 2001. It's a great story full of compelling characters and eerie environments, and this remake makes the gameplay much more enjoyable. Again, I was 4 when the original released, so that's just speculation on my part. The remake did have some performance issues on release, but I'm pretty sure they're already started patching them out, so if you haven't played this yet, now is as good a time as ever. I definitely recommend checking it out, especially for fans of the horror genre, and if you love the original, I think you'll find a lot to love in this remake as well. Well anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd be honored if you left a like, and should you like to see more from us, then feel free to hit that subscribe button too, if you're into that kind of thing. It does a lot to help the channel, and we appreciate all the support we get. Thanks for watching. I've been Tin from Tin Max, and I will see you in whatever we do next.